Good morning. This morning we are beginning the book of Ezekiel, and I use the Enduring Word translation of the Bible, and my main commentary is David Gusick. Other commentaries that I use is Ralph Alexander, Daniel Block, Adam Clark, Charles Feinberg, Vernon McKee, F.B. Meyer, Campbell Morgan, Matthew Poole, Joseph Seiss, James Smith, Charles Spurgeon, John Taylor, John Trapp, Bruce Valter, Leslie Hoppy, Warren Wiersbe, and Reverend J. Stanford Wright. Today we're going to be talking a lot about the history of Ezekiel and his first vision. So he was carried away to Babylon between the first and second deportation of Judah. And like Daniel and the Apostle John, he prophesied out of the land, and his prophecy, like theirs, follows the method of symbol and vision. Unlike the pre-exile prophets, whose ministry was primarily either to Judah or to the 10 tribes of Israel, Ezekiel is the voice of Jehovah to the whole house of Israel. The purpose of his ministry was to keep before the generation born in exile the national sins which had brought Israel so low. Also to sustain the faith of the exiles by predictions of national restoration and the execution of judgment upon their oppressors and of national glory under Davidic monarchy. Ezekiel's in 7 great prophetic strains, and they are indicated by the expression, "The hand of the Lord was upon me." The minor divisions are indicated by the formula, "And the word of the Lord came to me." The events recorded in Ezekiel cover the period of 21 years. Chapter 1. This is Ezekiel's vision of God and his throne. Verse 1. Now it came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month of the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives of the river Chebar, that the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. Ezekiel was a real man. He lived in a real place on a real day, and he had this remarkable vision of God. The 30th year was likely his age, and according to Numbers, priests did not begin their temple service until their 30th year. This date also means that Ezekiel grew up during the reform years of King Josiah from 640 to 609 BC. Ezekiel's prophetic ministry here was, in a sense, a compensation for the priestly ministry, which the misfortune of exile had taken away from him. When his moment of ministry was due to begin, God summoned him to another area of work, which was prophecy. The priest was commissioned as a prophet at this time. If Ezekiel was 30 years old in 593, he would have been born about 622 BC. About 600 BC, when he was about 23 years of age, he got married. And with his wife, he went to Babylon as an exile in 587 BC. And he was, at that time, 597. He was at that time, the year was, when he wrote his book, the last dated prophecy of his book is in the year of 571 BC. So that would mean that he was 51 at that time. He would have lost his wife when he was 37, and then in a series of attacks, the Babylonian Empire overwhelmed the kingdom of Judah, and they were carried away captives. In 605 was the first attack, and that's when Daniel was carried away. Then in 597 BC is when Ezekiel and King Jehoiakim were taken away, and all the treasure from the temple was taken. In 587 was the last one, and that was when Jerusalem fell, and everyone else almost went to Babylon as exiles. There's no indication that everyone he stayed in Babylon. His ministry began when Judah still stood as an independent kingdom, but they were under Babylon rule still at that time. And the kingdom, the temple, still stood and it functioned in Jerusalem. During that time, there were many false prophets in Jerusalem and in Babylon, and they claimed that God would rescue Judah and all those who had already been taken, like Ezekiel, and they would return to Judah. Well, that was not true. So Ezekiel's message was a rebuke because of the sinful wish to escape the deserved punishment by God through the Babylonians. And then also to give God's people real hope instead of the empty hope of the false prophets. God granted these unveilings of himself in a mystic and a marvelous imagery that we really cannot understand or comprehend, I don't think. The mass deportation of the entire population is designed to break down the national resistance at home by removing the political and spiritual leadership and to bolster the economy and military machine of the conqueror's homeland. And that is by block. The river Kibar flowed southeast from the city of Babylon. It was a canal that Nebuchadnezzar had built. Ezekiel experienced these amazing visions by the river. Apparently, they came to him as visions, mental images like dreams while he was still awake. In verse 2 and 3, on the 5th day of the month, which was in the 5th year of King Jehoiachin's captivity, the word of the Lord came expressly to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Chebar. And the hand of the Lord was upon him there. So this begins the first strain with those words. The captivity in verse 2 of King Jehoiachim happened in 597, as was Ezekiel's. And that was 10 years before the complete fall of Jerusalem and Judah. The 5th year of his captivity would have been 5 years before the complete fall of Jerusalem and Judah. The specific date of his call is fixed at the 5th day of the 4th month, and assuming this was spring, new year, the call came to him on the 5th day of Tammuz, however you would like to pronounce that, which is the year 593, which translates, it was July 31st. So they can go all the way back and find out the exact dates. In verse 3, the word of the Lord came expressly to Ezekiel the priest. The name Ezekiel means the strength of God or being strengthened by God. And Feinberg gives us a list of the things that we know about Ezekiel so far. The meaning of his name, he was born in 627 BC. He was a priest. He was taken captive with King Jehoiachim in 597 BC. He was at Chebar, that was likely a royal canal that Nebuchadnezzar had built. He was married. He had his own house. His wife died during his ministry, and God told him not to remarry. He served during the same time as Jeremiah and Daniel. He did not make mention of Jeremiah, but he did mention Daniel 3 times in his book. And he prophesied for about 20 years. So those are some things about him that we know. He had an intense interest in priestly matters, such as the sacrifices. He wanted to make sure everything in ceremonial purity was right. And the temple, the precision in description and dating, all of that was what he really liked to do. He likely lived with other Jewish captives in this city or town on the river of Chebar. He also was God's agent or a representative in a special way because the hand of the Lord was upon him. The hand of the Lord was upon him means God's strength. And it's a concept in the name Ezekiel, which means God strengthens. Verse 4, then I looked, and behold, a whirlwind was coming out of the north, a great cloud with raging fire engulfing itself. And brightness was all around it, and radiating out of its midst like the color of amber out of the midst of the fire. Ezekiel saw this whirlwind, something like a tornado coming out of the north. And the north is often associated with God's judgment from the nations in the north who were enemies of Israel. This begins his description of what might be the most unusual and detailed vision of God in the scriptures. And taking Ezekiel chapter 1 through 3 as a unit, it's also the longest and most in-depth description of his calling in all of the scriptures. The vision Ezekiel had at the time of his call never left him. It stayed with him all of his life. And it's no wonder, because it is an amazing vision. It was significant that this vision of God and the living creatures came from the direction of captivity and conquest, which is Babylon, imposed upon Israel. And it was this way of saying that all these calamities came from God. The whirlwind Ezekiel saw was associated with the great images of God's presence. The cloud by day, the fire of night when they were in the wilderness is an expression of God's presence. This raging fire engulfing itself is a reminder of the burning bush in Moses' day, when the bush was burning, but it never was consumed by the fire. One great effect of this vision was to assure Ezekiel that Yahweh was the sovereign God of all creation, no matter how great Babylon was and how many gods they had and how great they thought their gods were. Yahweh was the only God, the sovereign God. The multiple temples, they had many temples in Babylon. They had incredible prosperity. They had industry and culture, and all of this probably made the Hebrew people who were exiled there seem very small, because in Judah they didn't have all of that. The radiating brightness is an expression of the glory of God. And if the message of Isaiah centers on the salvation of God, and then the message of Jeremiah on the judgment of God, and that of Daniel about the kingdom of God, that of Ezekiel is the glory of God, and that's what he talks about. Verse 5 through 9. Also from within it came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance. They had the likeness of a man. Each one had 4 faces, and each one had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the soles of calves' feet. They sparkled like the color of burnished bronze. The hands of a man were under their wings on their 4 sides, and each of the 4 had faces and wings. Their wings touched one another. They did not turn, one went straight forward. In verse 5, the living creatures were identical to the cherubim, and they have to do with the vindication of the holiness of God as against the presumptive sin of man. And he would put forth his hand and also take of the tree of life, he says. They appear to be actual beings of angelic order. The cherubim, or the living creatures, are not identical with the seraphim. They look somewhat different. They appear to have to do with the holiness of God as outraged by sin. The seraphim is considered to be with the uncleanness in the people of God. This passage is very figurative. I mean, if you can make it out and picture it in your mind, then good for you, because I can't. It's really unusual. The effect was the revelation to the prophet of the Shekinah glory of God, though. And revelations are connected invariably with new blessings and service. So 4 remarkable beings were noted from within this whirlwind that came from the north with God's presence. He identified these remarkable creatures as cherubim, angels of unique power and glory that surrounded God. And yet the Bible idea of cherubim goes way back to Genesis. In Eden, that guarded the way to the tree of life sword. Remember that. The artistic designs of cherubim were prominent on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant, and that was the mercy seat. And then the Ark of the Covenant represented the presence of God among Israel, and Yahweh was sometimes called He who dwells between. An earthly artistic expression of a heavenly reality. Sometimes the phrase speaks of earthly picture and sometimes of heavenly pictures, or heavenly, actually, reality. The interior of the tabernacle was decorated with designs of the cherubim. And when you got in there, it seemed like you were just surrounded by cherubim. The veil had cherubim decorated up on it. And the design of cherubim was prominent in Solomon's temple. The 4 creatures mentioned by John in Revelation surrounded the throne of God, and they are rightly thought to be cherubim also. Before his fall, Satan was among the cherubim who surrounded God's throne. Ezekiel is acquainted with cherubim from his training as a priest in the temple and with its representations of these creatures. And he noted that they were not men, although they looked somewhat like human beings, but they were angelic beings. And yet they had the likeness of men in general form and in their structure because they had hands, legs, but men don't have 4 faces and they don't have 4 wings. So when angelic beings appear to men and women in the Bible, they often say they have the likeness of men. Ezekiel will describe their faces. The fact that one being has 4 faces indicates that some beings can comprise more than just one person. And we see this in the Trinity. We have one God, but he has 3 faces. In that. So in a way, beyond our comprehension, before I can't comprehend it, there is one God in 3 persons. 4 faces indicate 4. So the cherubim are very angelic beings, and this is one of the few places in scriptures that tell us that there are 4 wings associated with these angelic beings. The Ark of the Covenant emphasized their wings. The prophet described the heavenly vision where he saw beings that he called seraphim. And when he described them, he said they had 6 wings. So it's likely that cherubim and seraphim are very similar, but being described slightly different from different perspectives. Maybe they're the same and it's just how one person saw them that makes a difference. The name seraphim means burning ones, and that seems to fit also with these cherubim because they were in this fiery. In verse 7, it says their legs were straight, being in the likeness of a man. They had something like human legs, but with very different feet. It says their feet were feet. I'm not sure what that means, but they sparkled like the color of burnished bronze. Their beings had a shiny, radiant appearance. The hands in verse 8 of a man were under their wings. It doesn't mention an arm, but surely they had arms. I would assume. They were close together, not spread out at large distances. Each one went straight forward. They didn't turn to the right or to the left when they moved, but kept straight ahead in their course. And there was nothing erratic or chaotic in their movements. In verse 10 through 14, we have more. As for the likeness of their faces, each had the face of a man, each had the face of a lion on the right side, each had a face of the ox on the left side, and each of the four had a face of an eagle. So these four beings each had four faces. Thus were their faces. Their wings stretched upward. 2 wings of each one touched one another, and 2 covered their bodies. And each one went straight forward. They went wherever the Spirit wanted to go, and they did not turn when they went. As for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches going back and forth among the living creatures. The fire was bright, and out of the fire went lightning, and the living creatures ran back and forth in appearance like a flash of lightning. Now that is moving quick. They're moving quickly here. In verse 10, each of the cherubim had the face of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. And in John's vision of heaven, he seems to describe 4 creatures with each one having one of these 4 faces. So James, would you read Revelation 6:4, 6 through 8?
Revelation 4, 6 through 8.
Yes.
Before the throne there was a sea of glass like crystal, and in the midst of the throne and around the throne were 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and in back. The first living creature was like a lion. The second living creature like a calf. The third living creature had a face like a man, and the fourth living creature was a flying eagle. The 4 living creatures each had 6 wings, were full of eyes around and within, and they did not rest day or night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come.
All right, so that's John's version of what he saw. His angels had 6 wings, but they're very similar. There's a few differences, but they're very similar. And most think that John simply described the particular face that was turned toward him in his line of sight. But these 4 faces or figures are a common motive in Christian art, especially in medieval times. This is how they pictured them. In the sculpture work on European cathedrals, one may often see the figure of a man with a book or either of all these 4 faces with a book in their hand. Now, some commentators say these 4 creatures speak of the ensigns of the head tribes as Israel camped in 4 groups around the tabernacle when they were in the wilderness. We had 4 groups, and then there were 3 tribes in each group. Then in Numbers, it mentions this, but it doesn't mention mascots here in the tribal banners. But Poole explains this. He says that there were 4 creatures whose portraits were in the 4 ensigns of the Israelites as they were marshaled into 4 companies, allotting the men of 3 tribes to each company. Judah's standard had a lion in its colors, according to Jacob's prophecy of that tribe. Ephraim had an ox. Reuben had a man, and Dan had an eagle. So they had the same 4 replicas here. 4 faces are important because they represent all of the animate creation in its excellence. The lion is the mightiest of the wild animals. The ox is the strongest of the domesticated animals. The eagle is the king of all birds, and man is the highest of all creation. So man is exalted among creatures. The eagle is exalted among the birds. The ox is exalted among the domestic animals, and the lion is exalted among all of the wild beasts. And all of them have received dominion, and greatness has been given to them. Yet they are stationed below the chariot of the Holy One, which we see in this vision. The 4 represent all creation that has feelings, sight, hearing, smell, all of that. That's what kind of creation they're talking about. And man is the highest creation that God made, and then the rest are under him. And since God sits on a throne above the cherubim, the thought is that all creation is subordinate to God. Of course they are. And there are many examples of paintings and sculptures that combine animal and human forms. And we've talked about that at one other time, like a winged bull with a human head. We're just not real sure what that means, but there's nothing like this in this vision of the angels. In verse 11, 2 wings of each one touched one another, and 2 covered their bodies. This is different, though not contradictory, to what was recorded in Isaiah. So Ronnie, would you read Isaiah 6, verse 2?
Above it stood seraphim. Each one had 6 wings, and with two he covered his face. With 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew.
All right, so here we're describing something that has 6 wings instead of 4. But there he saw the seraphim, the burning ones, with 6 wings, 2 for flight, 2 to cover their face, 2 to cover their feet. And Ezekiel seems to record the 2 used for flight and the 2 used to cover the feet. And we don't have any explanation why 2 did not cover the face here when they did in Isaiah, but not in Ezekiel. In verse 12, each one went straight forward. And the idea from Ezekiel 1:9 and 1:12 here is repeated for emphasis. These beings didn't turn when they went. They didn't move to the right or to the left when they moved. They went wherever the Spirit wanted to go. And it's hard to know if this refers to the spirit of the cherubim or if it refers to the Holy Spirit. If it's the spirit of the cherubim, it means there's no battle between the flesh and the spirit. And their flesh does exactly what their spirit wants them to do. But if it is the Holy Spirit, then they are perfectly responsible and to the leading of the Holy Spirit. Either way, it's good. And their appearance was like burning coals of fire. This is something radiant, bright, and even warm in its appearance of these cherubim. Isaiah described them, that Ronnie read, as burning ones, seraphim, and so did Ezekiel. Out of the fire went lightning, showing the power and awe associated with these creatures. The living creatures ran back and forth as fast as lightning. The cherubim were active, seeming to not stand still for a moment, and their movements were quick as they could be. In verse 15 through 21, we have some more. Then I looked at the living creatures. Behold, a wheel was on the earth beside each living creature with its 4 faces. The appearance of the wheels and their workings was like the color of beryl, and all 4 had the same likeness. The appearance of their workings was, as it were, a wheel in the middle of a wheel. When they moved, they went forward any one of the 4 directions. They did not turn aside when they went. As for their rims, they were so high they were awesome, and their rims were full of eyes all around the 4 of them. When the living creatures went, the wheels went beside them, and when the living creatures were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up. Wherever the Spirit wanted to go, they went, because there the Spirit went, and the wheels were lifted together with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When those went, these went, and when those stood, these stood. And when those were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up together with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Now that is just something I can't really picture in my mind, but maybe you can. In verse 15, a wheel was on the earth beside each living creature. It isn't easy to picture exactly what Ezekiel saw it described here. It's probably an idea of a grand 4-wheeled chariot type that is bringing the throne of God, though. And the general impression is of constant activity and motion, not only by the living creatures themselves, but also by the throne of God. And this is especially mentioned in verse 26, which we'll get to in a minute. In verse 16, Ezekiel saw a throne chariot, a supernatural chariot, giving the effect of great motion and irresistible progress, and that's by Feinberg. The color of beryl is a mineral that can come in many different colors, but one of the most notable colors is that of emerald. And this may mean that the wheels and their workings gave off a green color. A wheel in the middle of the wheel. Now, each wheel is composed of 2 wheels, apparently at right angles of one another. Now, this is impossible in reality, but in the vision, it enables the chariot to run instantly in any direction it wants to go, north, south, east, or west, at any time. And when they moved, they went toward any one of the 4 directions. And this sense seems to be that the wheels and their workings could move any way they wanted to. But there was no sense of chaos in all of that or disorder. They lost no time in a difficult or tedious turning, like we see a chariot. When you're going to a chariot and you want to go, you have to go this way. Well, the wheel just automatically went that way. They had faces directed and as readily moved forward on their way, whether east, west, north, or south. And as for their rims, they were so high that they were awesome. Now, I'm picturing a wheel and it's got huge rims around it. And then the rims were full of eyes. I can't hardly picture that either in my mind. What Ezekiel saw and what he described here. But the description of full of eyes was how John described the cherubim himself. So I think you've already read that. That was in Revelation 4:6. So we've already read that. But the sense here is of great knowledge and great intelligence, that they were the cherubim, very smart. The wheels symbolize the omnipresence of God with their eyes on their rims, and it suggests the omnipotence of God, seeing and knowing everything. So God knows and sees everything. So when the living creatures went, the wheels went beside them. As the 4 cherubim moved, so did the 4 wheels move. And they were so closely connected that Ezekiel could write the spirit of the living creatures, that it was in the wheels. The spirit was in the wheels, the cherubim, it was right next to it. In 13 months, this cherubim with this heavenly chariot would return to remove the glory of the Lord from the temple and from Jerusalem. And that's in Ezekiel chapter 9. We'll get to that much later. And yet God also gave Ezekiel here a vision of the return of God's glory to the temple, along with those of the cherubim and the heavenly chariot, which is in Ezekiel 43 that we'll get to later. All right, verse 22 through 25. The likeness of the firmament above the heads of the living creatures was like the color of an awesome crystal, stretched out over their heads, and under the firmament of their wings spread out straight, one toward another. Each one had two which covered one side, and each one had two which covered the other side of the body. When they went, I heard the noise of their wings, like the noise of many waters, like the voice of the Almighty, a tumult like the noise of an army. And when they stood still, they let down their wings. A voice came from above the firmament that was over their heads. Whenever they stood, they let down their wings. In verse 22, as Ezekiel looked above the cherubim, then he saw this space like the color of an awesome crystal. And there was something spectacular about the sky above the cherubim. Taylor regards this Hebrew word firmament being something firm, and it is by beating or stamping a piece of metal to make it just straight and clear, no dents or anything in it. And it usually refers to the curve of the heavens. When you look at the heavens, it's like an inverted bowl that we see. And in passages in Genesis, Psalms, and Daniel, it clearly has this meaning. But in Ezekiel, it has a series or sense of a firm level surface or a platform, just a straight thing. In the book of Revelation, this same phrase becomes a sea of glass, like crystal. And now would you read Revelation? Well, we've already read that verse. I'm still in 6. We've already read that. So it's like just a sea of glass in Revelation. And I heard the noise of their wings like the noise of many waters and the voice of the Almighty. And this seems to describe how loud and majestic the noise was. It was like a great waterfall. John used this phrase to describe the voice of the ascended Jesus, the voice of God, and the voice of a great multitude in different places. The living creatures responded to this voice that came from up above them. Verse 26 through 28. And above the firmament, above their heads, was the likeness of a throne. In appearance like a sapphire stone, on the likeness of the throne was the likeness of the appearance of a man high above it. Also from the appearance of his waist and upwards, I saw, as it were, the color of amber, with the appearance of fire all around within it. And from the appearance of his waist and downward, I saw, as it were, the appearance of fire with brightness all around. Like the appearance of a rainbow in a cloud on a rainy day, so was the appearance of the brightness all around it. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God. So when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of one speaking. Verse 26. Above the firmament, over their heads, was the likeness of a throne. Since the wheels and their working seemed to be on earth beside each of the living creatures there, and the throne came from above the firmament, the presence of God then was above the cherubim and the wheels and their workings. In the book of Isaiah, we have the principles of the throne of God. In Jeremiah, we have the practice of that throne. But in Ezekiel, we have the person who is on the throne that he sees the likeness of. Moses described parts of the heavenly vision with the blue color and brilliance of a sapphire stone, and he observes the most majestic throne that one could imagine, made entirely of lapis lazuli, which is a a precious stone, one of the most precious stones among the ancient people. On the likeness of the throne was a likeness with the appearance of a man above it. Now, this repetition of the word likeness that we've read all through here, it says it was the likeness of a man, the likeness of a throne. It means that Ezekiel was concerned to emphasize that what he saw were representatives of these things that were real, but it was not the real thing that he saw. It was a representative of it. And he would deny probably that he actually saw the throne. He saw a representative of the throne, the representative of God, the representative of the cherubim, their likeness. The description suggests that Ezekiel did not see a face or a body that he could have drawn, but rather just a fiery brightness that had a human shape on it. And he knew it was a living and personal being. The representation that Ezekiel saw of God was again something like a man, and we know that we have been made in the image of God. So he says it was something like God. It's consistent with other descriptions of God in many visions of other people in Isaiah and in Revelation. So would you read Revelation 4:3?
Revelation 4:3. And he who sat there was like a jasper and a sardius stone in appearance, and there was a rainbow around the throne in appearance like an emerald.
Okay. So the general idea that is that God made man in his image, and again, Ezekiel didn't say that God was a man, but that his appearance was something like a man. The color was amber here in verse 27. And this is the fourth association with color here. The first is beryl, which is emerald green. Then we had crystal. Then we had sapphire blue. And now we have golden brown or amber. And the amber is more literally like a glowing metal than a color of itself. It had the idea of something that shines like shining metal. And from the appearance of his waist and downward, it was like the appearance of brightness of fire all around him. Flashing red and yellow light came downward from this representation of God. And this suggests that his power and radiance goes from heaven down to earth. And the whole picture is of this colorful, bright rainbow in the cloud that James just read. And this throne of God was surrounded by the rainbow. And all around this setting was all sovereignty, power, authority, and glory. And this was the throne of God. And God set a reminder of that promise that he gave that he would never again destroy the earth by water. This is a promise that directs his sovereignty, so it's not against his promises. The throne says, and this is where God is, I can do anything that I want. But his promise says, I have to obey what I said was as a promise. And so that has to be done. A rainbow over the throne of God is a remarkable thing, showing that God always limits himself by his promises. And this radiant being he described was in fact God. And Ezekiel cannot claim to see him directly, but the appearance of the likeness of the glory of Yahweh. Many believe that such visions here are pre-incarnation appearances of Jesus Christ. And it suggests in the context that refers to Isaiah 6, but such appearances could illuminate or show maybe the appearance of Jesus, but they could not redeem. The redemption could not come until Jesus came in bodily form on the earth. This was a man, Jesus Christ, and this was the last and best part of the vision. Christ sat by the Father in super celestial places, far above all principality and power. That's by trap. So Ezekiel would be encouraged and strengthened because he had seen the mighty throne of God in the midst of the fiery trial that they were in. And he had seen the glory of God, and the glory is a term that's called kabod. And when it's applied to royalty and divinity, it denotes the sheer weight of a person's majesty. So we see how great God is. And it evokes a response of awe if you see even the appearance of it. In verse 28, I fell on my face. Ezekiel's response was humble surrender before such a God of glory that he saw. And God's response was to reveal himself through his word. That is one of the main ways he wanted to reveal himself. And something in this nature demands that he reveal himself in this way. And if Ezekiel didn't know it now, at this particular time in the scripture, he would surely understand that the glory of God is not just restricted to Jerusalem and the temple. The glory of God can be everywhere, that Shekinah glory. So are there any questions or comments on this chapter? To me, it's just, I can't picture it. I kind of had a picture of it, but I can't imagine what he saw. I'm sure it was awesome.
We will get to see it.
We will get to see it. And I want to see what this is. I want to see what these wheels are that had high rims and they could go in any direction and they had eyes on them. It's just an amazing picture of this vision that he had. And this vision that he had of God, it's amazing. Okay. Next week, we will go to chapter 2 and 3. I know it took a long time to get the first part through, but we have to know some things about Ezekiel, and we have to know about this first vision before we can go on.
It's pretty awesome.
It is all, I don't remember, and I've read the scriptures, I don't remember all of this.
I love that lining up the tribes,
Yes.
and seeing, I've never seen the eagle as Dan or the ox is,
I had not
that's
seen
wrong.
that either. So, but that's how,
that's phenomenal.
yes. All right, we'll see you next week.